The 6-year Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of World War II and one of the most critical. If the Royal Navy failed to keep the supply lines to Britain open, the island would be quickly starved into surrender. Any hope of freeing Europe from Nazi tyranny would be gone. But the sailors of the Royal Navy rose to the challenge. In all weathers and often against massive odds, they fought off Germany's U-boats and ensured that the merchant navy could bring in the vital supplies to keep the Allied cause alive. The Royal Navy was also in action in every ocean of the world, from the Arctic to the Pacific. The war at sea was to bring many bitter defeats and terrible losses. But by 1945, the fleets of three great opponents, the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, had been humbled. On the day war began, a signal flashed around the fleet. Winston is back. Churchill returned on the 3rd of September 1939 as First Lord of the Admiralty, the position he had occupied at the outbreak of World War I. The navy he took over was still the largest in the world, with 15 battleships and battlecruisers and 7 aircraft carriers. For centuries, it had been both Britain's main defense against invasion and guardian of her empire. The Royal Navy's sailors were all long-service professionals who knew they inherited a great fighting tradition. But for many of the young men recruited during the Depression of the 1930s, it also represented a great escape.
I think the furthest I'd been was to Plymouth, Torquay and that sort of thing, but never any great distance. Well, you didn't get around too far on a push bike. It was a whole new world, and the beautiful sunshine and all the rest. Yes, it was quite nice.
The navy they joined had 2 main fleets: the Home Fleet, based in wartime at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, and the Mediterranean Fleet, based at Malta and Alexandria. There were also smaller commands in the North and South Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Far East. Despite its size, the Royal Navy would face an enormous task if all 3 Axis powers came into the war simultaneously. Its young men were unaware of the demands which would soon be made on them.
I mean, when you're young, you're sort of brought up on heroics and adventure and the cinema, Hollywood and all this lot, wasn't it? You never thought about getting killed or wounded or anything else, you know. It was an adventure.
The adventure entered a grimmer phase as the fleet went to battle stations and officers and men of the reserves were recalled to duty. At the start of the war, the immediate enemy was the German Kriegsmarine, which had begun a massive expansion program. In 1939, this was far from completion, but the German Navy was still formidable. Its 5 pocket battleships and battlecruisers were specifically designed to raid the supply lines, and a large number of the Royal Navy's major warships were needed to pin them down. More sinister were the U-boats. Germany entered the war with 57, half of which were ocean-going types, and 120 more were planned. The U-boats quickly proved dangerous. Just 2 weeks after war began, U-29 sank the aircraft carrier Courageous in the North Sea. And less than 4 weeks later, the supposedly impregnable anchorage at Scapa Flow was breached in a daring raid which sank the battleship Royal Oak. Returning to Germany, U-47's captain, Gunther Prien, became a national hero. But it was the surface raiders which were the main threat to British trade in the early months of the war. The pocket battleship Graf Spee totally disrupted the sea lanes in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans throughout the autumn of 1939. She was eventually brought to bay by a Royal Navy squadron of 3 cruisers, and a fierce battle took place at the mouth of the River Plate. Although outgunned and severely damaged, the cruisers forced Graf Spee to run for shelter in neutral Uruguay. And 2 days later, her captain scuttled her rather than allow the ship to fall into British hands. The Battle of the River Plate was a much-needed morale boost for the Royal Navy during the early months of the war, and the crews of the 3 cruisers were greeted as heroes on their return to Britain. Success was to breed success. In February 1940, the Royal Navy showed its traditional determination when a destroyer squadron led by HMS Cossack pursued the Graf Spee's supply ship Altmark into neutral Norwegian waters. With the rousing cry, "The Navy's here," Altmark was boarded, as this hitherto unseen colour film shows, and the captured Merchant Navy seamen she was taking back to Germany rescued. The protests of a Norwegian gunboat were brushed off. But elsewhere, victory came less easily. The Royal Navy found itself fighting desperately to rescue Britain's armies, first from an ill-fated landing in Norway, and then off the beaches of Dunkirk, as Hitler's panzers swiftly routed the French and British forces. The successful evacuation of 340,000 men was a great achievement, but could not disguise the fact that Britain was now isolated, facing a Nazi-dominated Europe. Following the surrender of France in June 1940, Hitler's growing fleet of U-boats could operate from her Atlantic ports. Access to the ocean was easier, and many more submarines could be on patrol at any one time. Even though the Royal Navy tried to escort all Britain's merchant fleet in convoys, pre-war economies meant that it was desperately short of escort vessels and lacked adequate air cover as its enemy reached deep into the Atlantic. During the autumn of 1940, the U-boats began what their crews called the first happy time. Sinkings rose so rapidly that Britain's shipyards could not provide replacements. German long-range bombers attacked the convoys and brought U-boat wolf packs homing in on them. In desperation, Churchill bartered the use of British naval bases in the Caribbean for elderly US destroyers. But the sinkings continued, and it seemed that the U-boats were